Hello, friends. We've taken up Jesus' call to follow him. That's his invitation, right? Come follow me, and he says, and I will train you to be like me and to do what I do. And so today we taken a pause from reading through the book of Matthew together and asked the question, well, how did Jesus deal with death? Right? How is he modeled for us? How is he training us to approach death? What does Jesus and therefore us as Christians, how do we approach it? What is our posture towards it? Truth is, there's a lot of different postures towards death, a lot in the world around us. Steve Jobs famously said, no one wants to die. Even people who want to go to heaven don't want to die to get there. And yet, death is the destination we all share. No one has ever escaped it, he said. And that is as it should be, because death is very likely the single best invention of life. It's life's change agent. It clears out the old to make way for the new. He's kind of simply saying, hey, it's the circle of life, right? He's going full Lion King on us. Later in his life, though, he talked about having cancer, and because of that, thinking more about God. And he said, I find myself believing a bit more. Maybe because I don't want to believe, because I want to believe in an afterlife, that when you die, it doesn't all just disappear. This week I was watching a dialogue between N.T. Wright, who is a renowned Bible scholar, and a man named Peter Thiel. Peter Thiel is a billionaire investor, one of the first investors in Facebook, and also co-founded PayPal. And he's written a best-selling book, kind of focused on the future, but he wants to eliminate death. Here's what he said. He said, basically, when it comes to death, I'm against it. I think there are probably three main modes of approaching it. You can accept it, you can deny it, or you can fight it. He said, I think our society is dominated by people who are in denial on acceptance. And I prefer to fight it. He said, there are all these people who say that death is natural, it's just part of life. And I think that nothing can be further from the truth. Death, he says, is a problem that can be solved. And he's doing all he can to solve death with technology. There are lots of different approaches to death. What is Jesus' approach? We're going to walk with him through a story that John records in John chapter 11. Now, a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sister sent word to Jesus, Lord, the one you love is sick. When he heard this, Jesus said, this sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, that God's Son may be glorified through it. Now, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. And then he said to his disciples, let us go back to Judea. If you experience this, God's timing, or maybe we can think of it as God's delays, right? Why would Jesus delay here? Honestly, we don't know. Some point out that the math says that by the time Jesus was able to travel and to get to Lazarus, he would have been dead already. Some say it was to make a big impact, to reveal his glory, and that's here in the text. Some say it's that he wanted his followers to have more reason to trust him, and that's also here in the text. And the story doesn't tell us what he was doing where he was. And it could have been so important that it wasn't time for him to finish there yet. All of that could be at play here. But the most compelling thing to me is that Jesus doesn't have a sense of urgency here, right? He doesn't treat death like it's final. He's not terrorized by it, and therefore is not highly motivated to run off in order to avoid it, right? Verse 8, but Rabbi, they said, that's the disciples, a short while ago, the Jews, the Jewish leaders there, Bethany is a suburb of Jerusalem, He says, a short while ago, the Jewish leaders there tried to stone you, and yet you're going back? Jesus answered, are there not 12 hours of daylight? Anyone who walks in the daytime will not stumble, for they'll see by the world's light. It is when a person walks at night that they stumble, for they have no light. And after he had said this, he went on to tell them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, and I'm going there to wake him up. The disciples replied, love this. Lord, if he sleeps, he will get better. And then John adds this little bit of narration. Jesus had been speaking of his death, but his disciples thought he meant natural sleep. John adds that, right? He makes a note informing us, his readers, probably unknown to him, but thousands of years later, what he's saying is, hey, I was one of those guys, right? He's outing himself together with the others as being dense. Right? Verse 14, so then he told them plainly, Lazarus is dead, and for your sake I'm glad I was not there, so that you may believe, and let us go to him. And then Thomas, also known as Didymus, another one of his trainees, one of the 12, said to the rest of the disciples, let us also go, that we may die with him. Sarcasm, right? Well, let's go with him and die, is basically what he's saying, right? An Eeyore moment. And yet, as far as we know, Jesus accepts his begrudging obedience still as obedience. Verse 17, on his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, a suburb, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. What are they doing? They are doing this ancient Jewish practice called sitting Shiva. This is where people would come to you. If you've lost a family member, they would come to you and they would just sit with you. They wouldn't say anything. It was no words for 7 days. They would just come and be with you, sit with you. Love this practice because you know this to be true. There are some things that happen to us and some things we experience or go through that for which there are just no words, right? And so that's what's taking place. People are with Mary and Martha sitting Shiva over Lazarus. And when you're sitting Shiva, you kind of move with the family. They would go out to the tomb to grieve and come back to the house and back and forth. Verse 20, when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, and Mary stayed at home. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. Now, is this just an observation, right? If you had been here, or is she asking why, right? Can we find ourselves in this? Have we ever been there? Why, God, were you late? Where were you? Why did they have to die, right? Now, there's a simple answer to that last one. Why did Lazarus have to die? Because we all do, right? Harder for us as Americans than maybe anybody else, right? Because we work really hard at avoiding death, and that means our own, right? We find all kinds of ways and use our creativity to live longer, or at least look like we're not as close to death as we actually are, right? But we also use technology. We've created technology to avoid being around death. Most of us eat meat, but most of us who eat meat don't see the death that provided it, unlike our grandparents did. We used to lay out our family's dead in our living rooms, but now we outsource all of that. We hire people to deal with the nitty-gritty details of death for us. So when we do face death, it opens us up in a way, right? We face our limits, we face our fragility, we face our mortality, right? And even similar to now, in this lockdown of COVID-19, we're facing the truth that we're far more fragile than we like to think we are. We're way less in control than we like to think we are. Julian Barnes wrote what is considered the secular book on death. It's a book of essays titled Nothing to be Frightened of. And he opens with this sentence. He says, he's an atheist. He says, I don't believe in God, but I miss him. I don't believe in God, but I miss him. Notice, even people who don't identify as religious or Christian, secular people have this sense of things not being the way they're supposed to be, right? Especially when we face death. I had a friend named Jason back in the early 2000s. He was a college professor and identified as an atheist. As we got to know each other and became good friends, I was finally able to say to him, I don't think you're an atheist. I said, Jason, I think you're an apathist. You're apathetic about if there's a God or not. You just don't care. But he was eventually, in 2005, he was diagnosed with cancer, and he died in 2007 in his mid 30s. But at one point, he wrote this. I wanted to share it with you. He said, I've taken a big 180 as far as religion is concerned, but I'm very hesitant about it. It just seems like the natural thing for people to do in situations like this when we have cancer, when we're facing death. He says, it's funny, I just got a card from my stepbrother and his wife. They always take my illness as an opportunity to preach to me. I know they mean good, but if I turn to a God, I don't want it to be out of desperation. I want it to be out of a genuine desire to experience God. Nonetheless, facing my Maker is something I feel I need to do. This is truly one of the biggest struggles right now. But I have witnessed some pretty wonderful feelings and progress as a result, I think, of people praying for me. Jason and Julian Barnes, even those of us who aren't religious, are haunted by shalom, haunted by the peace that we were meant to live in, the wholeness and completeness that we read about in Genesis 1 and 2. We're haunted by the kingdom of God, which is deeply connected to that shalom. We sense it, we know it, we're made for it. The Bible says eternity has been set in our hearts. Verse 23, Jesus said to Martha, your brother will rise again. And Martha answered, I know he'll rise again in the resurrection of the last day. See, she's Jewish, and so therefore she believes in a resurrection, but not an individual resurrection. She couldn't imagine one person like Jesus resurrecting as as the first of all of those of us who follow him. What the Jewish belief was that all Jewish people would resurrect on the last day, right? When all time ended, God would bring forth all of the people, the Jewish people who had died. And so that's what she's thinking. Verse 25, Jesus said to her, he said, I am the resurrection, and I am the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? He says. Now, if this was a piece of music, it would crescendo right here. Like fireworks would go off, cymbals would slam, right? The choir would burst out in unison. This is just masterful, genius storytelling on John's part. But this right here is what we celebrate every Sunday, right? Every Easter and every Sunday. Jesus said, I am the resurrection and the life. It's the point of this whole thing. It isn't that resurrection is a doctrine or a creed or a belief or even a philosophy. Luc Ferré is a philosopher, has written a bestseller called A Brief History of Thought. That's this great little, very readable book on the history of philosophy. And he's an atheist, but he makes the argument in this book that the best philosophy for Christianity, or the best philosophy for humans, is Christianity, if you can believe it. He says he can't, but he believes it's the best for us. And that's beautiful, beautiful for Christianity to be recognized that way, Jesus' way to be recognized like this. But we have to acknowledge Jesus didn't leave us a philosophy or even a creed or a doctrine. He left us a meal, right? A meal we share with God, a meal that reminds us of his death and his resurrection, right? So sure, Martha believes a doctrine, but Jesus says, I am that doctrine. I love this because Jesus is forcing her and us out of abstract belief and into a personalized trust in Jesus. Do you believe this? He says. Do you trust that I am the resurrection. I am the life. Life. It's life now and forever. Some of us like to focus on the life now part, right? Others of us want to focus on the life forever part. This is both and. Jesus is the life. It is life with God now, stretching on into eternity. In Jesus' resurrection, he fundamentally changes the nature of death. Paul says, "Death, where is your sting?" Right? After Jesus' resurrection, we're not death can't separate us like it once did. It doesn't separate us from God or even ourselves or a community or our purpose. There is no sting. Imagine if bees didn't have a sting. What would they be? They'd be super cute, I think. Furry little honey makers, right? You'd want them to land on you like you want butterflies to land on you. One commentator said it this way. He said, Jesus has made death for believers, these are thick words, but catch it, death for believers, a conquered, superseded event of minimum duration. Jesus fundamentally changes the nature of death and makes it a conquered, superseded event of minimal duration. I've heard it said that for us, Christians, followers of Jesus, to fear death, it's like an unborn child fearing birth. Verse 27, Jesus says, or Martha says, "Yes, Lord, I believe you are the Messiah, the King." King language. When you hear Jesus, think king always. Jesus, kingdom, Jesus, kingdom. I believe that you are the king, the long-awaited king, the king we've been waiting for, who's going to come and set things right, the king of the universe. You are the Messiah. You are that king, the Son of God who has come into the world. And after she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. "The teacher is here," she said, "and is asking for you." And when Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now, Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house, comforting her, mourning with her, sitting Shiva, noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. And when Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. And then we get this simple 2-word verse, Jesus wept. That word troubled, in the Greek language, it's the same word you'd use for the roaring of a lion. We read it and we think sad. What John is actually writing is he's saying Jesus is royally ticked off in this moment. He is angry, hot. He is sad and angry, right? What is it that's making Jesus sad and angry? Let me ask you this. How do you feel when something or someone is hurting someone you love? Sad? Angry? Both? It's Jesus in this moment. Well, death isn't the end as far as Jesus is concerned. It's not the end. It is the enemy, right? It's one of our primary enemies. And contrary to what many think or say, death is not natural. I've sat with people as they've died. Sometimes it's been peaceful, sometimes it has been painful to watch, but it's never right. Listen, hear this. Our bodies and our minds are not supposed to betray us, right? This is true of death, but it's also true of so many other things. Anxiety, depression, cancer, heart disease, COVID-19. None of these is the way it's supposed to be. Best book I've ever read on sin has a strange title. It's called A Breviary on Sin. The subtitle is worth the price of the book. The subtitle says The Way Things Aren't Supposed to Be. It's written by a Christian philosopher named Cornelius Plantinga. And it's interesting because he refers to sin as the vandalism of shalom. It says Genesis 1 and 2 is shalom. It's the way everything's supposed to be. It's when God arranges things in the way it's meant to be, we thrive. That is shalom, but shalom's been vandalized. And we We, my friends, are the vandals, right? Death became our enemy when we tried a power grab in an attempt to be like God. I love this by a guy named John Sailhammer. This is a commentary called Origins on the book of Genesis. He says, the verdict of death consisted of being cast out of the garden, exiled, separate, alienated, and barred from the tree of life, cut off from the protective presence of community with God in the garden. Ironically, he says, when the human race, who had been created like God, sought to be like God, they found themselves after the fall no longer with God. Here's the line. Their happiness does not consist of their being like God so much as it does their being with God. That's what God wants, is to be with us and us to be with him, to enjoy life together. Right? And it's Jesus' life and his death and his resurrection that makes that life with God possible once again. And here he is, seeing someone he loves, and seeing these sisters that he loves being hurt by the enemy, death. And he's sad and he's angry. And the Jews around him, the Jewish people around him said, see how he loved Lazarus. Right? But some of them said, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. Take away the stone, he said. But Lord, Martha said, the sister of the dead man, by this time there was a bad odor, for he has been there 4 days. That's where I missed the King James Version, because it says, but Lord, he stinketh, right? I mean, that's just so good. Stinketh. We need to bring that one back. 4 days, though, that's significant. John is making a point. He's been there 4 days. The Jewish people believed the spirit would hover around the dead body, wanting to re-enter for the first 3 days, right? The first 3 days after they've died. By the 4th day, they're dead, right? Think of this like the Princess Bride. You're mostly dead for 3 days. By day 4, you're all dead, right? So Lazarus is all dead. Been 4 days. Then Jesus said, did I not tell you that if you believe, if you trust me, you will see the glory of God? Notice the progression. Just make this point. If you trust me, you'll see. How often, this is true for me, but how often is it true for you, where we want the other way around? Show me, and then I'll trust you, right? Let me see, and then I'll trust. And he says, if you trust me, you're going to see it, right? So, verse 41, they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me. And when he said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. And Jesus said to them, take off the grave clothes and let him go. Can you visualize this? Contrast it for a moment. When John writes about Jesus' real resurrection, when they show up, the ladies show up, they find his grave clothes folded. Right? Jesus makes his bed. Lazarus comes out like a zombie, so like a mummy covered in all of the death clothes. I love this. The early church fathers, many of them believe that he had to call Lazarus by name because Jesus, his authority was so powerful. If he didn't call him by name, tombs all over the place would empty, right? And they would all be coming out of their graves, which is amazing to imagine that Jesus having to go, wait, oh, I'm sorry, everybody else go back, just that guy, right? I'm just getting this guy. Let's just make a couple of observations as we land. One is this, that when death meets the king wins. Right? It's true for Lazarus. It's true for you. All of Jesus' friends will have a Lazarus moment, but better. I mean, Lazarus is going to die again, right? This is not the kind of resurrection that Jesus experienced, nor is it the kind that you and I will experience. Paul writes about it clearly in 1 Corinthians, where he says we're going to have brand new bodies similar to these, but something new, right? We're a new creation, and we're going to see that happen. He uses the metaphor of a seed. It's like picture your body now being an acorn, but our body in eternity being an oak tree. All of us are going to be buried in the ground or we're turned to ash, right? Think about all those who you have buried in the ground or seen turned to ash. All those that you love who will someday come out of their grave, right? Because when Jesus meets death, Jesus wins, right? Maybe we say it this way: Jesus didn't come to make bad people nice. He came to make dead people alive. Also, number 2 here, the only thing Lazarus brought to his resurrection was a dead life, right? So if you don't have anything to bring to God, right? If your hands are empty, um, then know that you have everything you need to have, right? Because all you need to bring is a dead life. Thirdly, is that question that Jesus asked Martha, where he looks at her, he gives her a truth. He says, I am the resurrection and the life. And then he says, do you trust this? Right? Do you believe this? Do you trust it? I, not a doctrine, me, Jesus, this being standing in front of you. I'm the resurrection and life. Do you trust me? Right? And I want a response like her response. And I think this is a question I have to be answering daily. Do I trust today that Jesus is the resurrection and the life? And I want my response to be, yes, King Jesus, I trust you. Right? I trust you. One last thought, and that is this. Because Jesus is, as followers of Jesus, Jesus is training us to be like him, right? So what is he modeling here for us? And one of the things I noticed that stands out to me is that he treats both the sisters a little bit differently, right? They both had the same question, right? If you had been here, if you had been here. And to Martha, he gives truth. He says, I'm the resurrection and life. Do you trust this? He challenges her, but he comforts Mary. She sees him angry on her behalf. She sees him weep. She sees him feel what she feels. He gives truth to Martha, but tears to Mary. The truth is, right now, there's a whole lot of us that are grieving, including you and me, but including the people in our lives. And if we're going to treat them the way Jesus would treat them, for some, we may need to speak some truth. And for others, we may need to join them in tears. Right? The gift is that this is the kind of Father we have. This is the kind of God we have. A king who, when he meets death, he wins. So may you go. May you go and go with hope, knowing death is not the end. It's just simply the enemy. Right? And go to war against that enemy with those in your life by speaking truth and bringing tears, by challenging and comforting and doing what Jesus would do and loving like Jesus would love. Amen. Grace and peace, my